The Gettysburg Address, written by Jennifer McStotts. Brother against brother. Fighting between brothers and sisters is so common that we don't think twice about it. But imagine being at war and fighting on one side, while your brother or sister is fighting on the other side as your enemy. The American Civil War was a long fight between two sides of the country. Soldiers sometimes knew their enemy because men from the same town and even the same family would fight on opposite sides. Many of the officers had trained and fought together on the same side in earlier wars. Some were close friends who found themselves on opposite sides for the first time. The Union was made up of the northern states, and the Confederacy was the southern states. From 1861 until 1865, the Civil War raged, and 750,000 men died in it. One of the war's most famous battles was the Battle of Gettysburg. On the morning of the first day of this battle, July 1st, 1863, Union soldier Rudolph Schwartz saw Confederate prisoners being led away. To his surprise, he recognized one of the enemy prisoners as his own brother. The Schwartz brothers hadn't seen each other since leaving Germany for the United States. The two men hugged, happy to see each other. They parted when the Confederate brother was taken away, never to meet again. Rudolph was killed in action that afternoon. How did we end up at war with brothers fighting against brothers? Why is the Battle of Gettysburg famous? President Lincoln and the Civil War. At the time Abraham Lincoln ran for president in 1860, slavery was legal in 15 southern slave states and illegal in 18 northern free states. Many slaves tried to escape north to become free. Lincoln was against allowing slavery to spread beyond the southern states. This upset lots of people in the South. They believed that if Lincoln became president, he would eventually end slavery in all the states. Many Southerners made their money from farming, and huge farms called plantations required a great deal of labor. Southern plantation owners thought using slaves was the best way to fill that need. They thought ending slavery would destroy their whole way of life. Things were different in the North. Northern states had lots of factories. Those factories did not use slave labor. Many people in those states thought that slavery should end. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. In the months that followed, 11 slave states declared their secession from the United States. They no longer wanted to be part of this country. Instead, they formed the Confederate States of America. Lincoln took office as president in March of 1861. The two sides went to war a month later. Soldiers who fought on the Confederate side were called rebels, or Johnny Reb. The southern states called it the War of Northern Aggression and fought hard for independence. The northern states supporting Lincoln and the United States were called the Union because they were dedicated to keeping the country together above all else. Their soldiers were nicknamed Yankees, or Yanks. Many Northerners wanted to end slavery and fought passionately in what they called the War of Southern Rebellion. Men, and sometimes boys, put on uniforms, Union blue, Confederate gray, and left their jobs, farms, and families to fight. Many thought the war between the states would last only a few weeks or months. By the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln had been president for 2 years. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had won many Civil War victories and had led troops north into Pennsylvania through Virginia and Maryland. Yet despite Union losses, Lincoln had kept the nation together. The Union marched more than 93,000 soldiers into Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and the Confederates more than 71,000. When the fighting stopped 3 days later, nearly 51,000 soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. For every 10 soldiers who fought in the battle, 3 were hurt or killed. The Battle of Gettysburg ended Lee's northward advance. However, the battle brought devastation to both sides as well as the town. Public buildings, and even private homes, had to be used as hospitals for the wounded. Every farm was a graveyard. Although the war continued for another year and a half, no other Civil War battle killed more men than the Battle of Gettysburg. The Gettysburg Address. The field at Gettysburg became the first national cemetery. 4 months after the Battle of Gettysburg, on November 19, 1863, the Soldiers' National Cemetery was ready to be dedicated. President Lincoln was invited to give a few appropriate remarks, but he wasn't the main speaker. Instead, one of the most popular speakers of the time, Edward Everett, gave the formal speech, one that lasted 2 hours. The other speaker. Edward Everett was well known to the crowd at the dedication that day. A former U.S. congressman and senator, he had plenty of practice speaking before an audience. Everett got more practice at Gettysburg. He spoke for 2 hours, longer than many movies last today. While a speech of that length might sound overwhelming or boring to us, it was common in the 1860s. The crowd applauded, but Everett praised the president for his short speech in a letter written the next day. I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes. In other words, Everett was impressed that the president said so much in so short a time. Lincoln wrote back that he was glad to learn that his speech was not a total failure. Days before the event, President Lincoln told a journalist that his speech would be short. True to his word, the president spoke for only 2 minutes. Still, Lincoln gave careful thought to his words on this solemn day. Witnesses describe Lincoln riding on the train to Gettysburg, and even the morning of the ceremony. He continued to write until it was time to go to the cemetery. The Battle of Gettysburg marked a turning point in the war, but even 4 months later, few people understood this. Confederate leaders saw their loss as a defeat rather than a disaster. Some in the North were sick of the war. They wanted to let the South go, and Lincoln couldn't tell them that victory was just around the corner. He knew it was not. Lincoln had to find a way to keep the Union strong and in the fight. That day at Gettysburg, he needed more than a good speech. He needed a great speech. What did President Lincoln say? Today, the Gettysburg Address is considered one of the most inspiring speeches in American history. Since Lincoln gave his famous speech before tape recorders were invented, however, there's no proof of his exact words. Reporters at the cemetery wrote down what they heard and then sent it by telegraph to newspapers. What's more, 5 copies of the speech exist that were written in Lincoln's own hand, all slightly different from each other. How did the president sound? Because the Gettysburg Address was given in 1863, we don't have recordings of it, but many witnesses and reporters wrote about it. It is said that Lincoln spoke loud and clearly, but also slowly and carefully. Lincoln's slow speech may have been for effect, to reflect how serious and solemn his words were. It also could have been because he knew his remarks were not very long. We now know that Lincoln was coming down with a serious illness when he gave the Gettysburg Address. Most who saw Lincoln that day describe him as appropriately sad and mournful. Lincoln's secretary also said his color was ghastly and his face haggard. The president mentioned weakness and dizziness on the day and the morning before the famous speech. By the time Lincoln boarded the train home, he was feverish and had a severe headache. He was later diagnosed with smallpox. The most popular version of the Gettysburg Address is the 5th and last one. Lincoln even signed and titled this version, which is why it is the most often reproduced copy and is considered to be worth almost $500,000. It hangs in the Lincoln Room of the White House. Here is the text of that version. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. A closer look. Let's take Lincoln's address line by line to better understand what he said. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. When Lincoln says 77 years ago, he means 4 sets of 20, or 80 years, plus another 7. The year was 1863. 87 years before was 1776, the year of the Declaration of Independence. When Lincoln says, our fathers brought forth a new nation, he means the founding fathers, such as Thomas Jefferson, who established the United States of America. Jefferson wrote the line in the Declaration of Independence that Lincoln refers to. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. Here Lincoln moves from the past to the present. He explains that the painful Civil War is testing the country, revealing its strengths and weaknesses by putting it under strain. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. The Battle of Gettysburg was one of the bloodiest of the long war, yet Confederate leaders showed no signs of giving up, and Lincoln knew the war was far from over. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. Saying the soldiers gave their lives rather than died puts emphasis on their sacrifice for their country. Lincoln was trying to unite the mourners on both sides of the war for the sake of the country. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. First, Lincoln says it's right to dedicate part of the battlefield as a national cemetery. Then he changes course and uses repetition to make his greater point. Lincoln uses synonyms for dedicate: hallow, which means to honor as holy, and consecrate, which means to make sacred. The president doesn't change his mind and decide that there can be no cemetery. He means that the soldiers' deaths have already made the grounds as sacred and special as they can be. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. In a way, Lincoln is saying that actions speak louder than words. It is for us the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Lincoln fills his audience with respect for the fallen soldiers, describing them as noble and honored. He uses that respect to inspire listeners to commit again to their nation, its freedoms, and the great task ahead, winning the war, ending slavery, and saving the United States of America. The speech ends with the most famous part, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Here Lincoln again uses repetition, but with a difference. Rather than using synonyms again, Lincoln varies one phrase with simple prepositions to remind us what our government is all about: people. Life after Gettysburg. Today, the handwritten copies of the Gettysburg Address are national treasures. The speech is also carved into the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., yet the audience reaction to Lincoln's speech that day was quiet. The Lincoln Memorial. Designed to resemble a Greek temple, the Lincoln Memorial opened in 1922. 41 years later, Martin Luther King, Jr. delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech from its steps. Great leaders like Lincoln and King have shown the power that words and speeches have to inspire change in America. Some say there was delayed, scattered applause, barely enough to be polite. Others describe the scene as hushed with a dignified silence. Some historians say there was no applause because the audience was so impressed. After all, in just 10 sentences, Lincoln had summarized not only the war, but also the spirit of a nation. We don't know what the audience thought of his address that day. We only know that Americans have been inspired by it ever since.